Hey everyone, Noah Zerby here. This is one of a series of videos in which we look at the state in the context of international relations. Today we're going to look at the pre-modern state, that is, the state as it existed before the rise of the Westphalian state system. As we've said before, international relations usually assumes the existence of the state, and it operates on the assumption that the state is the primary or the most important actor in global politics. Situations where the state is weak or ineffective, or maybe even simply doesn't exist, are assumed to be aberrations from the normal state of affairs in global politics. But as we'll learn today, the state has a specific historical trajectory. It developed into its current form from a specific historical roots in feudal Western Europe, and it developed and spread through networks of colonization, trade, and particularly political development in the post-World War II era. So let's get started. Now, a good place to start is to begin with the question of what predated the state. As we previously learned, the state as traditionally defined is thought of as the institution that exercises a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. That is, it has boundaries, a territory, population, and the capacity to enter into relations with other states. But in that form, the state is relatively new. But that's not to say that there have not been political structures or institutions of governance or other governmental structures before the emergence of the modern state. Indeed, it's possible to talk about a whole variety of different governmental structures or different kinds of governmental structures that predate the modern state. About 12,000 years ago, the first agricultural revolution, often referred to as the Neolithic Revolution, took place. At this point, groups in what is now Syria, Iraq, and Iran began to settle down, moving away from traditional nomadic or hunter-gatherer lifestyles. They settled down, stopped moving, and started farming. They began selecting seeds for cultivation, transforming wild plants into staple crops like corn, wheat, and rice. They domesticated animals to serve as companions like dogs and cats, or food sources like cattle and chicken, serve as other sources of other raw materials like wool from sheep, and to serve as sources of labor like horses or cattle. And they began transforming the environment to better suit their lifestyles through, for example, irrigation and deforestation to clear land for farming. What's particularly interesting is that while the earliest period of the Neolithic Revolution is usually traced to the Fertile Crescent of modern-day Iran, Iraq, and Syria, similar transitions took place independently about the same time in other parts of the world. Indeed, the archaeological record suggests that permanent human settlements and the rise of agriculture took place about 12,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent, about 11,000 years ago in the Yangtze and Yellow River basins of modern China, about 10,000 years ago in Micronesia, Papua New Guinea, and Indonesia, and about 7,000 years ago in the Americas, modern-day Mexico, as well as northern South America, and in sub-Saharan Africa. And what's particularly interesting is that all of these took place in roughly the same historical epoch, but apparently completely independent of one another. The traditional explanation was that people who settled down had access to a more stable food supply. But more recent research suggests that the quality and diversity of the human diet may have actually declined as a result of the Neolithic Revolution. Communicable diseases became more common, and life expectancy declined slightly. Average human height also shrank, suggesting that people had poorer diets. There's good reason to think that the amount of work people performed increased as well. So if life was more difficult as people settled into permanent communities and began farming, why did they do it? The creation of permanent settlements centered on agricultural production had several important impacts. First, and perhaps most importantly, it permitted the specialization of labor. Certainly the majority of the population were farmers, but new classes, including priests, artisans, and bureaucrats, began to emerge. And as agricultural technology improved and yields gradually increased over time, a growing population could be supported. The growth of surpluses also led to centralized political structures and hierarchies within society. Ideology and increasingly complex cultural systems emerged, and religion and science attempted to provide meaning and explain the world around them. New technologies also began to emerge. The development of writing permitted depersonalized transmission of information and created a historical record. The wheel made it possible to transport people and cargo over ever-growing distances. And the development of the arts, architecture, and other cultural markers led to more and more advanced societies and increasingly complex identities. Interestingly, there's also another development that closely aligns with the settlement of people into permanent communities: the desire to brew beer and to create alcohol. Beer is perhaps one of the oldest recorded drinks, created through the fermentation of cereals. But the process requires both time, which you don't have when you're constantly on the move, and a steady supply of grains, which are easier to cultivate when settled. Now, whether humans settled into permanent communities in order to brew beer, or whether they found out how to brew beer shortly after settling into permanent communities is unclear, but the two events are not that far apart in the historical record. Gradually, these trends resulted in the creation of new civilizations. The first recorded civilization was the Sumer, which arose in what is today Iraq around 6,000 years ago. The rise of the Sumerian Empire marked the beginning of the Bronze Age. Sumer was the first region to adopt irrigation, and it developed mathematics, including multiplication tables and the first use of the abacus. They constructed pyramids or ziggurats and developed complex systems of trade, money, and credit. But Sumer was hardly alone, and we have numerous records of other ancient civilizations. In the Middle East alone, we have, in addition to the Sumer, the Akkad, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Hittites, the Elam, and others, all before the year 0. Similarly, in the Mediterranean and North Africa, we see the Phoenicians, the Carthaginians, the ancient Egyptians, the Nubians, the Kerma, and others, again all before the year 0. Ancient India boasts a series of empires that rose and fell from about the year 3300 BCE on, and China had a long history of dynastic empires that began with the Shang dynasty about 1600 BCE. Ancient Europe had the Greek city-states, the Macedonians, and the Roman Empire, which we'll return to in another video. And all of these drew on advances made possible under the Neolithic Revolution, to develop increasingly complex political and economic systems, new cultures and identities which predate any modern understanding of the state. As human societies continued to grow more and more complex, state-like formations began to emerge. Eric Ringmar's Non-Western History of International Relations considers some of them in greater detail. Among them are the Chinese dynasties such as the Han, which established legal codes and some of the earliest bureaucratic systems to govern society, implemented a system of currency, and facilitated numerous technological advances, including papermaking, negative numbers, and the development of the ship's rudder for sail. The Abbasid Caliphate of the Islamic world at the time represented the height of human progress and scientific advance. The Incas constructed vast road networks to facilitate trade across their empire, and the Mongols had the largest land empire in human history, stretching from the Pacific Ocean all the way to Europe, and only turned away from Europe because they found nothing of interest or of value there. Across these and other societies, various arrangements we normally associate with the state existed: specialization of labor functions, trade, taxation, militaries, legal codes, bureaucracies, infrastructure, and so on. So that concludes our very brief introduction to pre-modern states. I hope you found it useful. If you did, be sure to check out the other videos in this series. Thanks for watching. Have a good day. Bye.